that between Harry and Henry, they both possess about 100 years' worth of friendship with and knowledge of and working relationship with Harold Pinter. And I'd like to start by asking them for a bit of a thumbnail sketch of how they first encountered Harold Pinter. Harry, you want to launch into it?
Well, I met Harold. Of those 100 years, Henry by far. No, nothing. Have some more.
Pejorative remark.
I met Harold in 1981 or 2. I can't remember which it was. Harold was a passionate lover of the game of cricket, and so was I. And he had a cricket team, a theatre team, actors, writers, called Gaiety. And one day a friend of mine rang me out of the blue and said, "Do you want a game of cricket on Sunday?" He had been selected but wanted to deselect himself, and the etiquette is you try and replace with another player. And he said, "Can you play in this game on Sunday?" And I said, "No, I'm not interested." And then he said, "Harold Pinter will be at the game." And I knew about Harold Pinter because I'd been to see No Man's Land, that production with Gielgud and Richardson, as a teenager. I was a teenager who was waking up to a feeling of calling towards theatre and towards acting. And of course I didn't understand a word of No Man's Land, but I truly felt the power of what was happening on that stage. And of course I wanted to know more about it. So when I heard his name, I associated with that play, and I said, yeah, I'll be there for that game. I went along, he was there, he prowled the boundary in black polo neck, black jacket, black trousers, smoking black Sobrani, and sipping whiskey from a hip flask at moments of heightened tension. And at the end of the game, he looked at me and he said, "So you're Burton, are you? You're Burton. Well, you're playing for us now, all right?" And I'm still playing for that club now, even now. And that's how I met Harold Pinter.
And how did your professional work evolve?
Well,
other than cricket.
Yeah, I think it's true to say that one of the great things about Harold, and there were many great things about Harold, he had an enormous interest in young people, in people beginning their careers as actors and writers. He loved anyone who wanted to play cricket. And so he knew I was going into 3 years of actors training at the Central School, which was the school he had enjoyed being a student at himself. He hated RADA. They were still turning out, rank starlets and people who talk like this. But the Central School he enjoyed, and I was going there. So he took an interest. And the minute I left began a career, he immediately started trying to help me. He offered me a job with Faye Dunaway, which I couldn't do because I didn't have an equity card. But it was an amazing thing. He just wanted to help. And of course, any young actor needs that help and wants that help. And I suppose about 4 years after that, and he started coming to watch the plays I was in too. And I think partly this is, and Henry can comment on this, but this is partly to do with the fact that he had a very difficult relationship with his own son, which became completely estranged. They didn't speak for the last 12 years or so of Harold's life. And my relationship with my father wasn't easy. And Harold and I fell over 25 years into a very natural surrogacy. I mean, we never talked about it as such, but that's what happened. We both wanted to have that relationship. We couldn't have it with the people we were related to by blood, so we had it together. And in the end, about 1990, he asked me to be in. He offered me the part in a brand new play of his, which he was directing, a play called Party Time. And that was an amazing thing, to be in an originating cast, being directed by him. My comparison is perhaps with a musician being asked to play in a quartet being conducted by the composer. I mean, it's just an amazing privilege, and I mean, it just catapulted my understanding of the process of acting. It gave me the greatest acting lesson of my life. And then we worked together a number of times beyond that. We even played father and son in Moonlight.
That's right. Henry, your time with Harold goes back a little further.
It's a wee bit further.
Now, there are essentially two meetings.
was true.
One during the war, when you were both evacuees as children,
That's right.
and then later on, when you both found yourselves in the same school
That's right.
as young men.
Oh, young, but vigorous men. No, we
Well,
first met.
let's hear the whole dirty truth.
Why must it be dirty? Can't it be pure? Can't it? Has purity left our lives?
It's his Blanche Dubois imitation.
Frank has this charming of habit. It reminds me of marriage, of always having the last word. But I first met Harold in 1942. In those days, most of the children would be evacuated from the big cities because of the bombing. Then when the bombing either didn't materialise or something, they'd drift back into town. And I found myself in Cornwall at a place called Gorenhaven. There was a castle there, and Harold was there. And we were just 12-year-old boys and talked a little bit about Hurricanes and Spitfires and Messerschmitts and, machine guns. And that was that. I never thought we'd meet again. And then we found ourselves in sort of grade 11, the equivalent of grade 11. And our first meeting was, he said to me, "Have you read this?" in a kind of imitation of himself. It was what's known in literary circles as foreshadowing. He said, "Have you read this?" And I said, "What is it?" I said, "You mustn't never get the impression that we treated." There were a group of us got together, 6 of us. We went around together, 6 of us. From this movie, Harry's excellent movie, you get the impression that Harry was treated with respect and admiration from the word go, far from it. The rest of us regarded him as an absolute menace. It was always ahead of us with girls, very important. That was his first priority. But also in literature, he'd introduce us to these uncomfortable people. James Joyce and, Hemingway. Even Hemingway is pretty new. And all these different people. And movies. He'd drag us off to see Buñuel and L'Age d'Or. And do you remember Buñuel? Do you remember Chien Andalou, where someone's eye is slashed with a razor? And we all thought this was all a bit off-putting and nervous-making. But we secretly, of course, admired him and loved him because he was so charismatic. When people talk about, did he change when he was famous? I was saying to, dear Frank and Harry, he was always famous. We never had any money, but we knew we were famous. We were sort of solipsis. We felt, any moment you don't shut up, we'll jump out of the window and kill us all. We were those sort of young men, because on a political level, we had to be like that to survive. We'd got together in 1947, when the full sort of horrors of the world were being unveiled, and it wasn't just that. We knew we had to put all that to one side, or we'd be swamped by it. And the fact was the atomic bomb had gone off in 1945, and none of us expected to survive. We thought we're going to be the only generation without children. We'd better make the most of our lives now. So when people talk about Harold as a political animal, they tend to talk about his opinions. He was always political. He defied masters at school. He believed, as he said himself, so succinctly, in freedom and the individual. He was always like that. He was always political in that sense. But we always regarded him with suspicion. And he passed this book to me in 1947. He said, "Have you read this?" I said, "No." "What is it?" He said, "It's called Black Spring by Henry Miller." I said, "Is it a romance?" "No, it isn't a romance." There was this kind of sort of actually growl in the way we talked to each other in those days, like dogs snarling at each other. "Have you read this?" A couple of days later, I brought it back and said, "What do you think of it?" I said, "There's a lot of excrement in it, isn't there?" But anyway, we all got together and we got on terribly well, but Harold, we had to disregard the threat his energy presented. He would fill any room with his energy. And I remember, bear with me, I told you this afternoon, once he came out of a public library. We never had any money. So we'd wander around, and public libraries are awfully good, as you know, or maybe you're too well off to know. Public libraries are jolly useful on rainy days, and we'd go in there. But this was a particular area which was the sort of seed bed home ground of the local fascists, because most of the fascists had been interned in the Second World War, but they'd been released immediately afterwards, and they immediately did what was most natural to them and what they were best at, which was beating up Jews. So Harold and the rest of us would spend our time either running away from them, or if we outnumbered them, chasing after them. There was lots of fighting. Harold's a very good fighter. So a lot of the time we just snarled at each other. Sometimes we'd fight each other. But be that as it may, we were in Oxford Public Library, and Harold came out, and he had this bulge under his coat. He said, "What's that? What's that? What have you got under your coat?" I said, "Nothing. Nothing under my coat." "What coat?" "Come on. What's that? It's a book, isn't it? "Oh, yeah. Book." You see, those days, we didn't speak as beautifully as we try to speak now. We spoke the language of the people around us, the working class East End chaps. Later on, when we became actors and moved with cultivated and civilised people as we do now, we speak rather differently. But in those days, we often spoke in the language, even when we meet up, and just before we died. You often spoke like that. Of course, that was language we knew very well. When we were with cultivated people, we often spoke differently. You know, Frank and Harry would insist on my speaking coherently and beautifully. You know, it's a bit like speaking in joined-up writing. But, so he said, "What's that book you got?" So he said, "It's a book by a fellow called Samuel Beckett." "What's it called? What's it called?" He said, "Murphy." "What are you doing with that? What are you doing with that? You've nicked that book, haven't you? "Well, and at those times, 1947, no one had heard of Samuel Beckett in England, except about 3 people. And it was before Peter Hall, you see, had directed Waiting for Godot, 1953. So he said, "It's a marvellous book. I don't know who this fellow is. He's absolutely marvellous." We said, "You just deprived 12 Hoxton charwomen of the chance to read Samuel Beckett. You've got no social conscience." It was 1947, and he said, "But it hasn't been taken out since 1939. So Harry will tell you he's had it. He's still got it on his shelves, that copy. So we didn't treat him with enormous respect, but we did absolutely love him. Because he enriched our lives, you see, right to the end. And that's something I was saying to, I'll shut up in a minute, you'll be glad to hear. He could easily have dumped us all when he became famous. No hard feelings on our part. He was famous, he deserved to be, good luck, mate. On the contrary, he remained fanatically loyal to us. Oh, it didn't flood, that's all right. He remained fanatically loyal to us to the end. In fact, I saw him the day before he went into his final coma. I just happened to be in London. We had dinner together. And
Well, tell the story about how that came about, which I think is extraordinary.
What?
You almost didn't have dinner together.
No, we didn't. That's right. He called up and said, "Are you free for dinner tonight?" I said, "I'm afraid not. My wife, has arranged for us to go down to her family in the country." Put the phone down. Then I realised he was extremely ill, terribly ill. And I said to Susan, my wife, "No, I'll join you later." And I called him back and said, "Yes, we can have dinner." So we did meet for dinner, and it was ghastly. It was ghastly because he was dying. He'd been told he had no time to live at all. And by a strange quirk, his liver had collapsed. By a strange quirk, he ordered liver and onions. I don't know why. He never touched it. There's a kind of defiant... I don't want to make a rude gesture in front of a cultivated audience, but he made a sort of up gesture to fate, really. "My liver's no good, here's another one for you." It wasn't the happiest dinner I've ever had, but I was awfully glad to see him. Bless him. I'll shut up now.
Please do.
You said he was a good fighter. Do you remember that story about how he had a punch up in the bar, in the Sloane Square station, because there's chaps in the bar. Harold had a pint at the bar, and the bloke next to him said, the trouble with Hitler was he didn't go far enough. And Harold said, say that again. And the bloke said, the trouble with Hitler was he didn't go far enough. And Harold went, ugh, and landed one right on him. And the bloke hit him, and they both got arrested. So they got carted off to the police station. The policeman in the end let him off. And Harold and the chap were both on the pavement again. The bloke said, you're quite right to hit me, I shouldn't have said that. But why on earth did you have to hit me so hard?
That's right, you're right. Harold said, so he said to me, you're one of those yids, aren't you? And I said, I beg your pardon. Harold said, you're one of those yids, aren't you? He said, so I said, what did you do? He said, then I hit him. I said, then what did you do? He said, then he hit me back. I said, what did you do? He said, then I really hit him. And he could really hit. And it came in awfully handy. If there's fascists around, ask for Harold Pinter. He was a very good fighter.
Now, you actually experienced a great deal of World War II bombing and rocketing, did you not?
We did.
That was something that was quite immediate to your experience.
Yes. Yes, well, it's why I went into the theatre, really, because at one stage in the war, the Germans had stopped using, as you know, no doubt, manned bombers. They were using revenge weapons, they called them. The Hackerschuckel Hagenwald, get bought. The V1 and the V2.
Or drones, as they're now known.
Well, it's the V1, as you know, is a sort of cruise missile. Brilliant little, with a 2,000-pound bomb in the nose. And the V2 was a rocket, a 60-foot rocket, 2,000-pound warhead. And for some reason, my parents took me to see Arms and the Man. In February 1945, in the middle of a very heavy air raid. And there were 750 people in the audience. We were sitting on the stairs, all of us risking our lives. It was a very heavy night of air attack.
And the two main actors were?
Well, it was the best cast they could assemble in England. It was Laurence Olivier, Ralph Richardson, and trying to be as good as Frank, as Bluntschli, in Arms of the Man, and Margaret Leighton, George Ruel, Sybil Thorndike, Louis Castle, the best actors in England. And Olivier was sharing the leads with Richardson. And Olivier was playing Sergius Saranov. And there'd be an explosion, and there was a huge chandelier over the orchestra pit, and it would swing. It's still there. The Albury Theatre now, it's called. It was the new theatre. This chandelier, giant chandelier, would swing across, and the theatre would shake, and the plaster would fall. And Olivier would pause and then finally say, when the explosions, reverberations would cease, he'd say, I never apologise, you see. And I decided then and there that theatre was much more exciting than life. All the best bits, all the boring bits were left out. But it is worth noting, bear with me, that that was in February 1945. The British were putting on, after a long and bitter, bitter war, putting on a mildly satirical play about war. A month later, in a gap in the air raids on Berlin, Albert Speer records in his biography that the Russians had not yet arrived. They didn't arrive for another 2-3 weeks. The Berlin Philharmonic put on a star performance of Wagner, the Gotterdammerung. And anybody was there, beautifully dressed. A brilliant performance. I think it was Furtwängler, who later discovered he was Swiss. But they... like many a fine German chap I met. But Max, yes, we won't go into that. But at the end of the performance, as the audience said, there were beautifully uniformed Hitler Youth lads holding baskets of cyanide capsules for the faithful to take home. And I thought how different an approach to the end of the war it was. You know, the dear old Brits saying, oh, well, it's all a bit silly, isn't it? And the others not quite like that. Now, I'll shut up.
It's quite a good idea for the Republican Party to pick up on.
That's right.
I'm sorry, that was completely gratuitous, and I have no right to say such. I just wanted to get a laugh.
We won't say a word about we won't say anything about your Tory party, will we?
No, go ahead. They're all as bad as each other.
What did you like about Harry's film?
The work with the actors.
Isn't it great to see Harold working with the actors? Just playing. You said a wonderful thing earlier today about how he had an innocence about his own work and could completely listen and hear and feel his own work as though for the first time when actors started to say the words.
Yeah.
And although he remembered every line, he was just as open to discovering something new about a play he knew inside out from 35 years.
It was such a generous player. You know, people think of him as forbidding and combative, and he could be. But he was also open, and he loved young people, and he loved kamikaze kids who'd try anything. I have to say, I'm not saying this to be nice or because you brought us supper, Carl, but this theatre he would love, because it's so adventurous and so generous. That's what he'd love, you know, try anything. And he was very generous. I was once in a play in New York. I think I should emphasise the word once. And a parcel arrived at the stage door, and he'd published 250 copies of some silly poems I'd written privately. And he gave me 25, sent me 25 copies. That's the sort of thing he would do. He was endlessly generous. And he didn't have to have me doing monologue. He gave me monologue to do in 1973 on television, but he could have had anyone do it. But he never said anything about it. He just asked me to do it. He was a lovely, generous man.
Frank?
I was just thinking, though, I wished you could have somehow stretched the time to include more clips of his acting.
Yes.
Because that acting segment was compelling.
There are things available. On YouTube, for instance, you can see his astonishing performance, and it's complete, of Kraft's last tape, which he did not more than a year and a half before he died. He did it from a wheelchair. It is an absolutely staggering piece of acting. I recommend it without reservation.
Yeah, it's true. But the gentleman said he'd like to have seen more of Harold's acting in the film. What else is worth looking at? Patricia Rosimer's wonderful film of Mansfield Park, which is fully available. Harold has a wonderful role in that, in which he's quite brilliant.
One of his best perfs you showed in New York. Harry did a marvellous commemorative day of Harold's work in New York. Although I thought the National Theatre in England did we were both in it, a sort of very star-studded and excellent evening of Harold. It didn't bear comparison with Harry's day. You know, Harold's movies and television screenplays being shown in one theatre, and we had panel discussions all day. Harry organised it wonderfully. One of the best performances I ever saw Harold give was as Goldberg in one of the BBC versions of The Birthday Party. He wasn't always relaxed as an actor, but sometimes when he was just magic.
That performance is extraordinary. Harry shared some of that with me when I was in London.
Yes.
And also on YouTube, you can watch Harold in 1959 acting in his own play, A Night Out. Just Google A Night Out or YouTube A Night Out. You watch a very young, incredibly energetic Harold in that play, doing that wonderful scene about the football players, and it's just great to catch the Hackney vibe. You know, it's really very pure at that point.
Yeah.
There's plenty on the internet of Harold's acting. Of course, I'd love to be able to show more. Yes, sir.
Was he the schoolmaster?
No.
That was that not Lindsay Anderson himself, the director of the film?
I'd have to see it again.
Perhaps.
I don't remember, but it's not Harold.
He played his father in Wit.
Say again, Susan?
In the TV version done for HBO, Harold has the part of Wit in Wit, the father. And he's also in Mojo.
Right. Oh yes, Mojo's another terrific movie that Harold is in, playing a gay gangster. The Tailor of Panama, that's another one. Yeah.
What's the ratio of actual material that you accumulated during these interviews and during the theatrical to what ended up on the screen? I mean, you have...
Well, do I have...
10 to 1, 20 to 1?
I guess it's probably 8 to 10 to 1. I mean, I was talking earlier about the filming of the workshop. It was the first thing I ever directed, as you know, and I'd just done the BBC director's course, and I managed to persuade the crews, the professional crews that we had helping us on the director's course to come and, in fact, BBC Training and Development gave me a crew.
But wasn't this almost accidental? Didn't you first do a workshop?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, Harold had had cancer and had had a major operation, was recovering, but felt he couldn't direct plays anymore because he was an incredibly successful and brilliant theatre director in his own right. And he said he was retiring from directing. And I just felt that was crazy. So I took my life in my hands and I said to him, will you do a workshop with me? And he replied, what's a workshop? Nobody had ever asked him. You know, many, many directors and actors and writers, distinguished people, are invited to come in and do masterclass. Nobody had ever asked Harold. It was just my good luck. And so we had an amazing day with some actors, and the great thing about workshops is you don't use famous actors because they interfere with the process because it's all about them. So you work with actors who just want to work for a day with Harold Pinter. And he loved that it was people he didn't know. And at the end of that day I thought, damn, if we had a camera in the room, we'd have captured something that other people would find useful. And then I had to ask him again. And then I had to ask BBC Training and Development and a producer called Robert Fox to give me some money, and you know, it all came together. But going back to your question, the fact is that almost everything in the workshop that was usable is in the film. We had hours, I mean days of footage. It was so badly directed by me that it was uneditable. At one point, we had 3 cameras in that little theatre. I mean, you see those empty seats. It should have been filled with students. What was I thinking, you know, to have Harold doing that work in front of 8 people and a couple of cats?
Is that the Almeida Theatre?
No, no, that's where we did the interview. Oh. We shot at the place called the Bridewell Theatre, the workshop. I mean, it's fine, it worked. But at one point, all 3 cameras had drifted to the same side and we're all filming the same person. You can't cut that. You can't edit that. So it was a big learning curve for me. But there's much more. Do you remember at the Almeida, I had you and Harold reading bits of No Man's Land, The Dumb Waiter? I've never even looked at it. I've never even watched it. I'd love to cut a longer version of the film, but it's so expensive. So yeah, it's about 8 to 1, I would have thought. Yes, sir.
Were all those actors on a first-name basis, Phil?
No. They were terrified. I had to. By the time Harold came in and worked with them, on the 3rd day of that workshop, it was a 3-day workshop. Harold only came in on the 3rd day. They'd all had 2 rehearsals of about an hour each. So what they were doing with Harold was their 3rd rehearsal and about the 3rd hour of rehearsal. But
it's kind of like one of our evenings.
Exactly. Well, no, but I think that's very much to the point. You know, the actors and directors in the room know that sometimes a workshop or a reading pushes people into a greater risk and a bigger piece of courage. And that's what they had to do, because they all, the day before, the night before, they all said, this is appalling. We don't know the lines. We have no idea what we're doing. And now we have to do all that in front of Harold Pinter, who wrote it. And I said, yes, and that's the point. If you can just keep breathing and let go of the outcome, just let go of the outcome and take the next big step in your rehearsal process tomorrow in front of the cameras, and we'll have something. And they all did that. You know, that takes huge courage. And Harold naturally, quite naturally, which I guess I knew if I was lucky I'd get, he quite naturally empowered that. But workshops and readings are sometimes, I think, the most exciting things to be present at. Yes, please, shout out.
When did you start working on the film, and when was he first diagnosed with cancer?
He was diagnosed with cancer?
Oh, about 2005, was it?
No.
Something pretty...
Yeah, December.
December 2005. I think.
December 2005.
But it's a peculiarly ghastly
Yeah,
cancer.
2001 he was diagnosed with cancer.
Esophagus cancer, which is usually fatal, but he was one of the 5% who survived the operation.
It's what Hitchens died of.
Yeah.
And when did you start working on the film?
I guess about 2006. It's about 18 months. You see, there's an interview, there's the workshop, and then there's the interview in his study, which is just a single shot of him. That's the day after. He got so drunk after the workshop that the next day he looks quite sweaty and not very well. And then Henry came over probably about a year later, when Harold had, he weakened quite a lot in that year.
Yeah.
This is a little bit of an odd question, but I hope you understand what I'm asking. It seems to me the world is split up into two kinds of people. People who get Pinter and people who don't. And my question is, when he wasn't writing, did he think like Harold Pinter? Do you know what I mean? That funny, brilliant, quirky, odd thing that he does, did he think like that?
Well, I don't think he, sorry to interrupt
Or just
you.
when writing?
I just think that naturally he was extremely selective when he wrote and how he wrote. One of the most selective writers, as far from a stream of consciousness as you could get. But in ordinary life, that just came out naturally as it does with any of us, as part of his mode. Do you agree with me?
I do, I do. Would you allow me to read something?
Yes.
No. No, I tell you why. Because one of the great questions is, why did he write about the things he wrote about? What was, why is it always so weird? What's that? So the second ever production of The Birthday Party was done in Scarborough, and the first had been such a disaster that this very bright man who taught Harold at the Central School called Stephen Joseph asked Harold to direct the second production. This is in 1959. And Harold cast a young actor called Alan Ayckbourn as Stanley. But the cast were completely baffled by the play, and they couldn't wait to get Harold on his own and pump him with questions so that they could try and understand the play. So they took him to a pub in the first week of rehearsal, and they were just about to corner him. We were just about to get going on the play and ask Harold, what does it mean? But before he could tell us, a bloke slid in opposite us, very distraught. Do you know this? Very distraught. He said, "Can I sit with you for a minute?" "Yes," said Harold. The chap said, "I'm sorry, I've just had a terrible experience and I need to tell someone." Yeah. "What is it?" said Harold. "I think I may have killed my mother-in-law." Harold said, "Oh, really? How did this come about?" He said, "Well, I've been married a short time. I come home with my money on a Thursday, and every time that bloody woman's there, and she just snatches the money out of my hands without a by your leave. We're living with her, me and the wife, and I'm prepared to pay our rent, but she takes the whole bloody lot. So I got home a bit early this evening before she got in, and I hid it. She came home and she said, 'Where the hell is it?' and started tearing the room apart, trying to find it. She eventually said, 'I know, it's up the chimney, isn't it?' It's a big fireplace. And she got in to look up it. I grabbed her by the ankles and I shoved her up there. She's up there now, she's wedged in. I didn't know what to do, so I just ran out." Harold said, "Oh, well, I think she's probably inhaling a lot of soot. She could be suffocating. I don't think you want to be on a murder charge for your mother-in-law. You may dislike her, but you don't want to go to prison for her." The bloke agreed. "You're absolutely right. I'm not bloody swinging for her." And he ran out. There was a long silence. And I said, "What an extraordinary man." And Harold said, "Was he?"
Very good.
You get it?
Very good.
That's by Alan Ayckbourn. That's written. That's on the internet. It's by Alan Ayckbourn.
One of his at the end of being told a story like that, it's a lovely story. We had various traditional ways of talking to each other, and Harold would say after something like that, one of us would say, "It's a funny old world we live in." And the other one of us would reply, "But the world's not entirely to blame." And we often say that over the years, maybe several thousand times. But is it worth saying this? It's a little bit boring, but that has never stopped me. Is that people don't seem to realise that Harold revolutionised the British theatre. You would, because you're the avant-garde of the cognoscenti. But the fact is that because of something called the Butler Education Act, in 1944, children, boys and girls, had to stay on in school in England till they were 16. As a result, a whole class of really working class boys and girls graduated when they were 16, and by 1957, when John Osborne is given the credit, not quite rightly I think, for this this sea change in British writing, which had always been respectably middle class. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with middle class bums on seats. That's what keeps theatres going. But nevertheless, we want to attract young, nubile bums, as they say in the Navy. And the thing is that
Where are you going with this?
there we are.
He doesn't mean tramps, he means buttocks.
Even we know that. They've been trained.
It's impossible to finish a sentence.
Sorry.
Not that it is. But the fact was that these guys who've been at school, these working class boys, were now by 57 writers, and they're using the language not of the middle class writers writing for a middle class audience. They were writing for everyone, including their peers, the working class boys and girls who had now entered a sort of middle class, as it were. So Harold's birthday party wasn't just a different sort of play. It was a play no one had ever seen the like of before, about people they'd never seen the like of before, using language that no one had ever heard before. So Osborne usually gets the credit for that, but Look Back in Anger is fairly tamely predictable. It's a good enough play, nothing wrong with it. But they still play it in insomnia clinics. But I think it was the birthday party that really was revolution. I think that's worth revolution.
It is, and the fact that the play ran for a total of 8 performances in its first run, you know, how closely it came to not happening.
Or they wanted to kill it, all right. It's very odd. I remember when I was in Rep, I think, in Bristol. I opened the Times, I think it was. Those days, the Times critics didn't have to print their names. They could say anything. And there was a not particularly brilliant play by Bernard Copse called The Hamlet of Stepney Green, getting a rave notice. And then somebody took a dagger and wrote the review for the birthday party. One of the most damaging, destructive reviews I've ever seen. Why try and assassinate a young writer with his first full-length play? Why try and kill him? Because they didn't understand a word he was writing. They hoped to nip him in the bud, and they couldn't in the end.
But someone did.
Yes, Harold Hobson. He saw, you know. And I'll tell you an interesting thing. When we did The Room for the first time, lots of laughs. By the time it was done the second time, the grim hand of reverence. Here was an important artist taking off, no laughs. And the audience was told very clearly to sit up straight and listen. They were at a cultural event. And there's lots of productions of Pinter like that, and lots of productions of Chekhov like that. You know how poignant Chekhov is when its humour is allowed to burgeon, and how sterile it is if it's played like death from the start. There's lots of productions of Pinter like that, and of Chekhov, but it's when they're allowed to breathe and laugh.
I promise you, we will not do them that way.
I knew that, Frank, the moment I saw you.
One of my favourite things about Henry is that he directed the very first production of Harold's very first play, The Room, and played Mr. Kidd, and 45 years later played the same part. How many actors in the world, in the history of theatre, have ever played the same part 45 years apart?
Well, it was lucky I remembered the line.
You must have thought, you know, this is familiar.
Hello,
Yeah.
I remember that chair.
Yes.
Now, when you called him, or wrote him, or wired him, whatever you did, to ask him to write The Room,
Yes.
what was your expectation?
Well,
Did you have a sense that it was just going to burst out of him?
I thought it might, because, you know...
Well, it sort of had to, didn't it?
Well, it just had to. There's a great chance. There is a tide in the affairs of men and all that. But he had done something remarkable already. As he said earlier, in rep, he was rehearsing next week's play in the morning, learning the lines for the next play in the afternoon, and playing at night. And yet he managed to write hundreds of poems, lots of letters to his friends, lots. I've got about 60, and a friend of ours in Australia's got 200. Lots of letters, and to write a novel, The Dwarfs. So he had extraordinary energy, but he wrote back saying, I can't do it. But in the end, he did it. You know.
And really was 2 or 3 days, wasn't it?
He says 4 days, but actually it was 2. It was pretty good, too. It was really, I thought it stood up awfully well when we did it again 45 years later. And there was his first play and his latest play, Celebration. I thought it stood up really well.
Absolutely.
You remember that?
Oh, wonderful.
Now, Harold was a conscientious objector at the age of 17, 18?
Yes, 18.
When such a thing was, I assume, primarily based on religious conviction, correct? Or scruple?
No, it just, he didn't want to kill people.
Oh, I know that his reasoning was different.
Oh, I beg your pardon.
He didn't, but that was the argument that was most often made.
No, I'm sorry.
If I'm not mistaken.
Right. Yes, yes.
But he had a somewhat different approach. And I know that you have the document that he wrote.
I've got a paragraph of it. Well, I may have.
And this is written by 17 or 18-year-olds.
I found this. I found in Harold's study after he died, I was given keys to his study, and somebody had obviously sent him the papers from his trial. I don't think he would have dug them out himself, but I think somebody was researching and had sent him copies of the court papers from his trial. And he was tried twice, wasn't he?
Yes.
Because the first time they found his arguments to be specious, and he was allowed to appeal. So he got a second bite, as it were. But he was required to write his submission, to write why he didn't feel he could serve. And apart from one newspaper article in the Sunday Times, I don't believe any of this has ever been published, but some of it has been, so it's not copyright. And well, I'll just read a paragraph. As human beings, we are bound to bring forth and foster that inherent wisdom and goodness which is endowed in us, and replenish and illumine our fellows with this spiritual realization. Each person is compelled by this moral responsibility to hold sacred human life, to cast out fear, and to fulfill this existence as a creation out of the immense order of things. The dismissal of these principles, the betrayal of all Jesus Christ, the great mystics, and Dostoevsky have said, has led to the perversion and ignorance of man today. The position in society for one who believes in his responsibility as a man is simple. He shall, with great sorrow and love, defend the innocent, with physical sacrifice and moral enlightenment. But on no account shall he be the arbiter of another human's existence by taking arms. Nor shall he tarnish his soul by joining such a stupid, sorrowful organization as the army. With these beliefs, it is therefore quite impossible for me even to contemplate such an act. And the tribunal's judgment was, the tribunal is not satisfied in this case that there was any genuine conscientious objection to either form of military service. The applicant was dogmatic, and his statements did not show any sign of careful and conscientious weighing of pros and cons.
Hello, hello.
But the magistrate fined him instead of sending him to prison. 18 years old. So I'm afraid the people who say that Harold's political conscience and beliefs was an act or a pose or some attempt to...
or latterly arrived at.
Or latterly arrived at. I'm afraid not. He was... I believe he was born fully fully formed in that aspect of himself, and that the whole of his life is that acorn growing into the full tree.
But I think that's what makes it so difficult, is you watch his characters do such ugly things to each other, and you know, I think you have to do what we've been able to do since Frank's sort of been doing this, see a lot of it, and see that it's more than just this particular ugly scenario. See what it all means.
It's not gratuitous. It's based on the experience of his life, which Henry has described so beautifully. What the condition of growing up in Hackney and during World War II must have been. You told me the story about this tree in his backyard, did you not?
Well, Henry should speak about that more than me.
No, go on.
But the actual conditions that these children
yes, I mean, they
grew up in.
You know, they lived through the Blitz, the war. I mean, Harold was an only child, and certainly in Michael Billington's book, it very quaintly says that he had imaginary friends and would play around the tree in his back garden, the magnolia tree, I think it was. But that one night during a firestorm, during an incendiary bombing, the tree caught fire. So this boy of, what would he have been? 10 years old, looks out to see that his own tree ablaze. I mean, how immediate can the impact of war be on the child of a psyche without, you know, actually having to lose a parent? Or, but it's a poetic. We feel that as a poetic image as well as something that would have obviously completely burned itself onto his consciousness. Yeah. And there's another story about him being in an air raid shelter and making out with a beautiful girl. You know, at the age of 11 or 12. I mean, he was sexually precocious.
No, 13. He was
13,
approaching the age of consent.
So the war... So, you know, that consciousness was forged under this immense pressure. I mean, all of theirs was. But he was, you know, a poet already at the age of 12. He told me, certainly, that he was writing love poetry at the age of 12, and his father came down and caught him one morning writing a poem at the kitchen table and said, "What's that? Show me that." And read it and then said, "All right, carry on." Well, you know, that's all a kid needs to feel, okay, I'm a writer then, I'll be a writer. If the father had torn that poem up and said, how disgusting, that might have, you know, been a different story. What about when he was bar mitzvahed and went out and bought Ulysses? What did his dad say about that?
I forget what he said. I forget. He didn't think it was great.
I think he said something like, I will not have that book in the same room as where your mother cooks dinner.
Something like that. But his parents loved him and accepted this strange son. This lovely, very good looking and a lovely boy, great athlete. He broke the school 100 yards record, 200 yards record, terrific cricketer, terrific soccer player, and very clever at school. His parents loved him and they encouraged him. They didn't always understand him. They were absolutely opposed to him being a conscientious objector. And we were talking about Pauline Flanagan and that lovely woman, and when he announced he was going to marry her, I foolishly wrote a congratulatory postcard saying, "Well done, how jolly good." That doesn't go down too well in Jewish households. The enthusiasm for marrying Catholic girls is somewhat limited. So Jack Pinter said, if Henry Woolf comes to our door, I'll knock him downstairs. And being the idiot I've always been, I turned up 5 minutes later, and Jack Pinter answered the door, and his face seemed rather dark. He wasn't the usual jolly Jack Pinter, I knew. I thought he must have toothache. I've always been very sensitive, you know. But anyway, he was lovely, and they were lovely. And he loved them to the very end, and he wrote one of his... See, I secretly think his best poems are his plays, but one of his best non-play poems is one about his father, when his father died, called Death.
Do it then.
Sorry, can you bear it if I read it to you? Do you want to do the whole of the bush?
Well, I asked Harry to read that the statement that Harold wrote as a conscientious objector. And I thought it might be interesting for Henry to read the final page and a half or so of Harold's Nobel Prize acceptance speech, his lecture. My thinking was the consistency of thought and commitment to ideals that it represented. Embedded in that is this poem called Death. And may we possibly indulge you?
Just the poem, I think.
No,
Just the poem. Is that all right, chap?
Absolutely.
It goes like this. When his father died, he wrote this poem called Death. It went, "Where was the dead body found? Who found the dead body? Was the dead body dead when found? How was the dead body found? Who was the dead body? Who was the father or daughter or brother or uncle or sister or mother or son of the dead and abandoned body? Was the body dead when abandoned? Was the body abandoned? By whom had it been abandoned? Was the dead body naked or dressed for a journey? Who made you declare the dead body dead? Did you declare the dead body dead? How well did you know the dead body? How did you know the dead body was dead? Did you wash the dead body? Did you close both its eyes? Did you bury the body? Did you leave it abandoned? Did you kiss the dead body?
Thank you, Henry.
It's a lovely poem, isn't
Bit depressing, though, isn't
it? There you are. You try to be serious, and what do you get?
it? Should we get some more questions? Any more questions?
Poor guys.
How many authors, playwrights, provide a script that needs no revision? I mean, I'm stunned that Pinter didn't revise anything, but how often does that happen?
Well, of course he did revise.
Okay.
He just didn't do it in the rehearsal room.
Okay.
I mean, Henry can speak to this, I think, very, very eloquently. But I think what one has to remember about Pinter is he's a poet-playwright. And therefore, and he's an actor, poet, playwright. So he's literally turned every line in his own voice and turned it and looked at it. And the ruthless cutting. He once said, maybe I cut too much, but he left so much out. And he road tested every line and every character so that he really finished each line. And that's why it's so important that actors don't come along and say, well, wouldn't it be better if I said in it at the beginning of this? Because the work's being done. And that's the point. What do you want to say?
No, I think what you say is right. He actually did revise, but he revised before.
Okay.
And he wasn't a dictator. He loved and was excited, as Harry said earlier, loved and was excited by discoveries in his plays, by the actors and by the director. But at the same time, he was terribly concerned that the script, as it was written, was presented. Nothing different.
But in the British Library, you can see the drafts of many of the plays and how they develop and change. So yeah, he's a writer like any other in that sense. He just, unlike many writers, he presents something that's truly wrought and complete, as a poet must,
You know, an analogy that occurs to me is it's kind of heresy in acting terms to suggest that actors know their lines before the first day of rehearsal. What are you talking about? What about the process of inner, outer and sideways discovery? But Noel Coward, and Olivier too, I think, certainly Noel Coward, always insisted that all his actors knew all their lines before rehearsal started. Now you'd think that was a straitjacket, But I always ask when I'm directing that actors know their parts, because it allows them so much freedom. When your Hamlet knows every line backwards, it doesn't mean that they've imposed some straitjacket on themselves or the text. And no more does Harold's strictness about his lines. It isn't a straitjacket. It's actually quite liberating. So you can't move beyond the confines of this text. You have to discover within it.
Unfortunately, it precludes our ever working together.
Well, perhaps that's for the best.
Yes. Well, I did detect an unfortunate note of relief in your voice, Frank.
Not in the least.
His dialogue is unique. He said something interesting about his dialogue not being used to exchange information, but it serving a defensive posture.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if you could expound a little bit on that.
Well, it's just that you know how, apart from sort of, would you like some sugar in your coffee, most people prattle on, and quite rightly too, but in his plays, which are so tense with defense and attack and jostling for superiority, and jostling sometimes, like in The Caretaker, for actual territorial possession of a space. Your inner space, the other person's space, your status together, you know, like in old times, you know, the way the two people jostle for Kate and Anna, and, you know, they jostle with each other, but the lines aren't just really... When someone, as they often do in Pinter, as a non sequitur, Mr. Kidd in the room often replies with a non sequitur. It's never an accident. They don't want, they've heard perfectly well, there's been asked, they don't want to reply. They're in the process of defense or attack or preserving themselves or their situation. And although everybody knows that goes on in life, not all the time, thank God, no one really had made that so explicit in a play before. And it was so unusual and marvellous. And it brought to life something that I don't think Harold did himself justice on in the movie, about silences and pauses. Because the fact is, when you get dialogue so rich, so filled sometimes with menace and attack and defense, rich dialogue, suspended from that dialogue is the play. It's as if Pinter's the puppet master, but his marvellous words are just really suspending the life of the play, which exists under the words and in the pauses and in the silences. That's where the life of Pinterland lives. And so I think that use of the ambiguities, the non sequiturs of speech, are never there by accident, and where Harry's comments on closely worked language is terribly important. And does any of that make sense?
Would you like to give us an example of that?
Gosh. Well, you know when Mr. Kidd said...
I didn't mean that. I meant by reading the scene together.
Oh, no, I could never do that.
Oh, yes, you could.
And I think this is a particularly good one to shed
Oh,
light
heavens, the script has just arrived in my hand. It would be absolutely discourteous to refuse, wouldn't it? Fortunately, I've come prepared.
This is the opening sequence from The Homecoming. Max, the father.
You're playing that, aren't you?
And Lenny, the son.
What have you done with the scissors? I said, I'm looking for the scissors. What have you done with them? Did you hear me? I want to cut something out of the paper.
I'm reading the paper.
Not that paper. I haven't even read that paper. I'm talking about last Sunday's paper. I was just having a look at it in the kitchen. Did you hear what I'm saying? I'm talking to you. Where's the scissors?
Why don't you shut up, you daft prat?
Don't you talk to me like that. I'm warning you. There's an advertisement in the paper about flannel vests, cut price, navy surplus. I could do with a few of them. I think I'll have a fag. Give me a fag. I just asked you to give me a cigarette. Look what I'm lumbered with. I'm getting old, my word of honour. You think I wasn't a tearaway? I could take care of you twice over. I'm still strong. You asked your Uncle Sam what I was. But at the same time, I always had a kind heart. Always. I used to knock about with a man called McGregor. I called him Mac. You remember Mac, eh? Ah, we were two of the worst dated men in the West End of London. I tell you, I've still got the scars. We'd walk into a place, the whole room would stand up. They'd make way to let us past. You never heard such silence. Mind you, he was a big man. He was over 6 foot tall. His family were all McGregors. They came all the way from Aberdeen, but he was the only one they called Mac. He was very fond of your mother, Mac was. Very fond. You always had a good word for her. Mind you, she wasn't such a bad woman. Even though it made me sick just to look at her rotten, stinking face. She wasn't such a bad bitch. I gave her the best bleeding years of my life, anyway.
Plug it, will you, you stupid sod? I'm trying to read the paper.
Listen, I'll chop your spine off, you talk to me like that. You understand? Talking to your lousy, filthy father like that?
You know what? You're getting demented. What do you think of second wind with the 330?
Where?
Sandown Park.
Don't stand a chance.
Sure he does.
It's not a chance.
He's the winner.
He talks to me about horses. I used to live on the course. One of my loves of my life. Epsom, I knew it like the back of my hand. I was one of the best known faces down at the paddock. What a marvellous open-air life. He talks to me about horses. Ha! You only read their names in the papers. But I've stroked their manes. I've held them. I've calmed them down before a big race. I was the one they used to call for. Max, they say. There's a horse here. He's highly strung. You're the only man on the course who can calm him. It was true. I had an instinctive understanding of animals. I should have been a trainer. Many times I was offered the job, you know, a proper post, by the Duke of, I forget his name, one of the dukes. But I had family obligations. My family needed me at home. The times I've watched those animals thundering past the post, what an experience. Mind you, I didn't lose. I made a few bob out of it. And you know why? Because I always had the smell of a good horse. I could smell him. Not only the colts, but the fillies. Of course, the fillies are more highly strung than the colts. They're more unreliable. Did you know that? No, what do you know? Nothing. I was always able to tell a good filly by one particular trick. I'd look her in the eye, you see. I'd stand in front of her and look at her straight in the eye. It was a kind of hypnotism. By the look deep down in her eye, I could tell whether she was a stayer or not. It was a gift. I had a gift. And he talks to me about horses.
Dad, do you mind if I change the subject? I want to ask you something. That dinner we had before, what was the name of it? What do you call it? Why don't you buy a dog? You're a dog cook, honest. You think you're cooking for a lot of dogs.
If you don't like it, get out.
I'm going out. I'm going out to get myself a proper dinner.
Well, get out. What are you waiting for?
What did you say?
I said shove off out of it. That's what I said.
You'll go before me, Dad, if you talk to me in that tone of voice.
Will I, you bitch?
Oh, Daddy. You're not going to use your stick on me, are you? Eh? Don't use your stick on me, Daddy. No, please. It wasn't my fault. It was one of the others. I haven't done anything wrong, Dad. Honest. Don't clout me with that stick, Dad.
I'll chop your spine off. You'll drown in your own blood.
No greater love. Well, maybe one or two questions, and I think we probably exhausted
These poor guys.
the theoretical limits of a talkback. But,
Frank?
Yes, Arnie.
It's not a question, but I couldn't help but be reminded that Pinter reminded me of Groucho Marx. Anybody else get that? I've been watching some things of late Marx, and he had that twinkle and that wit and that sense of observation and listening. He looked just like Groucho.
Is that something?
I'm surprised at all. Anyway.
Well, I think we've come full circle. Well,
Did he and his son reconcile before he died?
no.
No. His son didn't come to the funeral. And I've lost touch. I wrote to him last Christmas, but he didn't reply. He lives in complete isolation in Cambridgeshire somewhere.
Who was the mother? Vivian?
Vivian.
Vivian was the mother.
Yeah.
Who you saw in the clip from the homecoming with the glass. That's Harold's. That's Harold's first wife.
Yeah.
She died of alcoholism.
Well, yeah.
Yes, you mentioned his fondness for young theater artists, and I was just wondering, when it came to new writers, was there anything that he was specifically excited by or irritated by, attracted to?
Well, I know he was incredibly excited by anyone who showed the courage of their convictions, particularly in a kind of with a poetic voice. I mean, Sarah Kane, who tragically committed suicide. Harold made great gestures of support to her, was outspoken in her defense when she was, as he had been when she was being attacked as a new writer, for trying to do new things, for trying to make it real again, for trying to make something happen. He was incredibly supportive of her, of Jez Butterworth, whose Jerusalem is such a triumph.
He helped. Heathcote Williams wrote a sort of book about the speakers in Hyde Park Corner. It was turned in as a Penguin book, but Harold got it published, really. And then it was turned into a play, and he became a very successful playwright because Harold gave him his start, really. And Harry was in touch with him just the other day, weren't you?
Yes, I mean, no writer who Harold supported ever forgot that or got over the wonderful sense of connection and support and mutual respect that Harold nurtured in writers. He had no greater respect, I think, for an actor who wrote. That was his, he just felt that great fellowship with someone, taking that similar risk.
Well, Doug Lucy told me that he attended his play Grace in the early 90s, and Doug was there that night. I guess it was the press night or something. And Harold warmly congratulated him, and it's one of Doug's fondest memories of writing plays for 35 years.
Yeah. But here's a bit of Harold that isn't generally known. When they absolutely destroyed the birthday party, it was a terrible disaster for him. a very young man, you know, 27, his first full-length play being absolutely destroyed. I was living in a bedsitter or something in London. He came to see me. He says, "You know what I've done?" He said, "I've written another full-length play, and they can go," I forget the exact words, they were impolite. "They could go and bleep, bleep, bleep." And he wrote it, and it was The Hot House. And then I said to him, "What's happened to The Hot House?" And he said, "It's not good enough. I'm not going to have it published or performed." But he did 20 years later. I remember once I was at a mutual friend of ours. I had everything that Harold had ever written except a copy of his novel, The Dwarfs. I said to this friend of mine, Johnny Rees, you know, who was, you know, Johnny Rees was an actor. He was the actual Cliff in Look Back in Anger in Real Life. That's something else. And I said to Johnny, "Whatever happened to The Dwarfs? I've never got a copy of it. I've read it." And in those days, lots of actors and lads and ladies had their books on bricks, planks resting on bricks. We reached up for a book, it was about 3 in the morning, and there was a collapse of planks and books, and out from underneath stood this manuscript, which was 30 years old, by that time literally yellow with age, and it was a freshly typed copy, 30 years before, of The Dwarfs. So he lent me it. And I reread it, and that night, one of the main characters in it is a chap who is called Len in the book, but actually his name is Mick Goldstein, lives in Australia. At 1 in the morning, the phone rang. I was a bit surprised. I answered it was Mick, and I was just laughing at something his character had said in the book. And it was Mick calling from Australia, saying, "Hello, I'm coming to London." So it all seemed to fall into place. And I called Harold the next day and said, "Why won't you have The Dwarfs published?" He was well able to then, you see. It was years later, when he was famous. He said, "Because it's not good enough." I said, "Well, I've just read it, and take my word for it, I think it is." And then I went back to Canada, and 3 weeks later he called me and said, "I've just spent the last 3 weeks editing and cutting The Dwarfs, and it's going to be published." And one of the nice things about him is the person he took to the book launch wasn't Antonia, it was the girl from Hackney, Jennifer Gibson, who's the main character, the only woman in the book. And so that's what happened. I only say that because he was quite capable of being extreme, just as encouraging as he was to young people. He could be very hard on himself. He really could.
What were his habits as a writer? Did he write daily? Did he have any habits? Did he write in bed? Did he write in the toilet? What was his way as a writer?
I don't know.
Very irregular, I think. I think he wrote in bursts of tremendous... I think Henry put his finger on it in the film when he says that the room must have been tightly coiled within him and came roaring out. I think again and again Harold had the experience of something roaring out of him after the blue, what we call in England for fireworks, the blue touch paper had been lit by something, an image or a word or a phrase, and then something comes through.
That's very different from the kind of writer, like a very good writer like Edward Bond, writes, when I was working with him, every day except Sunday. It's a job, he does it, and other writers I know do that. Don't think Harold did that at all. It's what he says, it's all there.
I found this wonderful quote. You mentioned the story about Murphy, the book, because Harold loved Beckett, but why? And this is what he said about Beckett's writing. "I suddenly felt that what his writing was doing was walking through a mirror into the other side of the world, which was in fact the real world.
Yes.
What I seemed to be confronted with was a writer inhabiting his innermost self. The book was also very funny." But I'm so grateful for him articulating that, because I can, as an idiot, I can get hold of that idea of trying to get through past oneself to the point where there's something worth saying about the world, and then trying to say it as economically and as intensely and as hopefully funnily as possible.
I think that could well apply to Pinter's own work.
Well, of course, he's literally aspiring to that. That's his model. He worshipped Beckett for that reason and considered himself an infinitely lesser writer, did he not?
I think so. I think so. He did love him, his writing and him. He was a very nice fellow, Beckett. I've never met anybody who didn't say he was the nicest fellow in the world.
Mm. And he loved Harold very much. Harold's favourite book was Ulysses. He kept that, he read that, he never stopped reading it. It was by his bed when he died.
I didn't know that, you know. Isn't that something?
Mm.
How did they meet, Beckett and Pinter?
Well, Harold, I think, Harold had been writing to Beckett, and very formally, after Godot, and then he began to send his manuscripts to Beckett, and Beckett would reply, and you can see the replies in the British Library. And then Beckett said, let's meet, and Harold went to Paris, and they got roaring drunk together. There's a beautiful little couple of paragraphs about it, and they ended up in some bar in Les Halles or somewhere, and Harold passed out at the table. And when he came to, Beckett had gone, and he thought, perhaps I've dreamt the whole thing. Turned out Beckett was driving around in his de chevaux all the way around Paris trying to find Andrew's liver salts so that Harold could get over his hangover.
And Harold told me about that visit. That's a marvellous one. Told me about that visit, and he said to a friend of his, I'm just going to see Beckett in Paris. And the man said, really, I've just come back from having lunch with Beckett. He said, why do you hesitate? What's the matter? He said, nothing. He said, come on, what is it? He said, well, it was rather odd, you know. I'd arranged to have lunch with Beckett, and I called him up, and a little old lady answered the phone, said, oui, que voulez-vous? And he said, Monsieur Beckett, s'il vous plaît. And the old lady said, oh, maman, s'il vous plaît. And there was a pause, you see. And then there was a sudden, terrible cacophony of metal objects being hurled about. Crash, bang, bang. He had to put the phone away from his ear. And then he heard a voice say, Beckett here. So he said, yes, sir, what's all about that? He said, well, what transpired was I went to lunch with Beckett. Had lunch in the kitchen. And the phone rang. And Beckett said, excuse me. He picked up the phone and said, hello. And he said, Monsieur Beckett, and he put the phone to one side and paused. And then he went round the kitchen, seizing every saucepan and frying pan, and threw them all over the floor. Bang, crash, Harold, cacophony. And then picked up the phone and said, Beckett, yeah. That's the truth. I'll tell you a nice thing about Henry Miller. When Harold wrote to him and said, I think I'm going to prison for being a conscientious objector, Henry Miller took the trouble to send Harold about 12 to 15 hard-covered books of his. So these will keep you company.
Well, this has been an amazing evening. And I can't thank both of you enough for being here and for so generously telling us your stories. I'm sure that everybody in this room will remember them for a long, long time.
They'll try to forget them, but they can't.
They won't be able to.
One more question.